My name's Ryan Thorne, and if you asked anyone in Westport who owned Thorne Agritech 10 years ago, they would have said, my dad, Grant Thorne. Not because he craved fame, he was a simple man with calloused hands and a quiet stare, but because he built that company from dirt. From fixing tractors in a barn to running one of the biggest agriculture equipment manufacturers in the Midwest, my dad built an empire, and everyone knew it. When I was 16, I started working there part-time, sweeping floors, cleaning gears, getting barked at by supervisors who didn't care I was the boss's kid. Dad made sure of that. "You don't get anything here because of your last name," he said. "You earn your place or you don't stay." I respected that. I loved it. That business was the only place I ever felt close to him. But when he died suddenly in a car accident, just a week after my 21st birthday, everything shifted. My mom passed 2 years earlier, so I was left alone. Or so I thought. My dad's will was simple. The company would be held in trust until I turned 25. Until then, it would be managed by his younger brother, my uncle Dennis, and his son, my cousin Parker. I didn't even flinch when I heard that. Parker was older, smarter, had an MBA from Stanford. Everyone in the family loved him. I thought, okay, we'll run it together someday. God, I was naive. The first year, I was pushed aside. They said they needed me out of the way while the board stabilized leadership. I accepted it, even when they shut down my access to internal documents. The second year, they told me it was better if I focused on my education, which, ironically, I paid for by selling my car because I couldn't get anything out of the trust without their approval. The third year, I started to worry. The company began changing. Our core agricultural division was sold off, new branding appeared, and suddenly Parker was showing up in magazines as a visionary founder. I was no longer mentioned anywhere. When I confronted Dennis, he smiled and said, "Your dad was a good man, Ryan, but you need to understand, this world moves fast. We had to make decisions he couldn't." I asked if the trust was still intact. He patted my shoulder and said, "You'll get what's left, kid." That phrase stuck with me like a splinter in the bone. What's left? I was 23, 2 years from regaining control, and my cousin was already treating the company like it was his birthright. But the thing was, I kept quiet because I had a plan, because I knew what they didn't. I had copies of everything. I never told Parker or Dennis that my dad left me a private backup of the company's original bylaws, shareholder structure, and his last amendment to the trust. A sealed letter he never submitted, but which named me as successor outright without age restriction. It wasn't legally binding, but it proved intent. More importantly, I had every email my father ever sent from his company laptop, which he gave me after I graduated high school. They didn't know it still worked. For the next 2 years, I played along. I smiled during family gatherings, nodded when Parker told stories about acquisitions he made, and pretended to be grateful when they wired me my small quarterly trustee stipend. But behind the scenes, I was digging. I got a business degree online. I interned under a competitor without using my name. I started learning the back end of industrial supply logistics, how private equity worked, how buyouts were structured. I read books, took late-night consulting calls, met with lawyers in secret. The more I looked, the more I realized something terrifying. Parker wasn't just sidelining me, he was gutting the company. He sold off 2 of our manufacturing plants to fund a new tech smart farming venture. He diluted the original shares and issued new ones to outside investors, claiming it was to drive innovation. But the worst part? He forged my digital signature twice on internal trust memos that allowed those votes to pass. I wouldn't have known except for one old employee, Gloria, my dad's longtime executive assistant. She sent me an anonymous email with one line. "He's not just replacing you, Ryan. He's erasing your father."
She attached a PDF with Parker's internal pitch deck for rebranding Thorn Agritech to Parker Tech Farms. My stomach turned. I looked at the date, 2 days before my 25th birthday. They were planning to officially roll it out the day before I became legal owner. So I flew home, quiet and unnoticed, and went straight to the county records office. The trust still legally held a controlling interest, but Parker was trying to move everything into a new LLC structure that would essentially trap me out of access. That's when I made the call. Not to a lawyer, to a fixer. A guy I met while consulting at a private logistics firm in Texas. His name was Marcus, and he specialized in hostile corporate takeovers. "You sure this is the road you want, kid? Once we start, there's no making peace later." I said yes. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wasn't going to let my father's legacy die under a man who cared more about magazines than machines.
The first step was simple. I became a ghost. Officially, I moved to Denver. I let Parker and Dennis think I was living off the trust's scraps, bartending part-time, maybe wasting away in some studio apartment. In reality, I was working 12-hour days at a competitor Parker didn't even know existed, Midwest Agri-Systems. It wasn't flashy. It didn't have a tech wing or glossy branding. But it was profitable, clean, and run by people who hated Parker as much as I did. They gave me a desk, a fake last name, and access to everything. Over a year, I studied Parker's every move from the inside out. His acquisition strategy, his supplier rotation cycles, his seasonal vulnerabilities. Marcus had warned me, corporate takedowns weren't just about money. They were about timing, leverage, and legal ambiguity. So I built a paper trail. I gathered evidence of the forged signatures, collected whistleblower memos from fired employees, even hired a forensic accountant to confirm Parker had embezzled over $400,000 from the trust under the guise of executive operational costs. That was my hook. Once I had enough, we triggered Phase 2. Marcus incorporated a holding company in Delaware, Red Branch Holdings, and we began buying out minority shareholders Parker had forgotten existed. Small stakes, silent investors, most of whom didn't even attend board meetings anymore. We offered them 20% above market rate. By the time Parker realized it, we owned 27% of Thorn Agritech. That was when we went public. Quietly. We filed a demand for a full shareholder review of Parker's decisions over the last 36 months. Legally, he couldn't refuse. The moment the review landed, the board started panicking. He called me, voice fake warm. "Ryan, hey, I was just thinking of you. I heard from one of the trustees you're poking around old shareholder docs. Everything okay?" I almost laughed. "Everything's great," I said. "Just doing a little cleanup. You know how Dad hated clutter." There was a pause. Then a shift. "If this is about money, we can work something out." There it was. Panic wrapped in diplomacy. "No," I said. "It's not about money. It's about principle." I hung up. That week, Marcus and I triggered Phase 3. We filed an emergency injunction to freeze Parker's ability to move any more assets out of the trust's name. The court granted it, 48 hours before he was scheduled to finalize the rebrand to Parker Tech Farms. His entire rebrand launch was canceled. Investors began pulling out. His CFO resigned. Dennis called me, furious. "What the hell are you doing, Ryan? You're destroying everything your father built." That's when I lost it. "No," I said. "You did that, the moment you signed off on replacing Dad's name with Parker's. You think this is revenge? This is restoration." I offered them a deal. Step down, transfer all remaining shares back into the trust's control, and walk away quietly. They refused, so I did what I had to do. I leaked the internal emails. The ones where Parker mocked our farm workers, called Dad's old colleagues dinosaurs, and openly discussed using my forged signature. It went viral in the local business press. Gloria gave a whistleblower interview. 2 other board members flipped. Within 3 weeks, Parker's empire was in free fall. And I hadn't even touched the nuclear option yet.
The nuclear option wasn't flashy. It wasn't a scandal or a fistfight or some dramatic courtroom speech. It was a spreadsheet. One that proved Parker had over-leveraged Thorn Agritech's supply chain through shell companies registered to an address in Nevada, companies owned by a woman named Caitlin Rhodes, Parker's ex-girlfriend, not his wife, not even his accountant. And one of those companies had been bleeding the trust dry for 5 years, billing Thorn for logistics optimization services that didn't exist. I handed the whole file to the IRS, quietly, anonymously, through Marcus. While that bomb ticked, I went for the throat, a vote of no confidence. As a major shareholder, now controlling 43% of the board through silent partners, I called a special meeting. Parker showed up cocky, thinking I was bluffing. He didn't know I'd flipped Gloria and 2 other members with hard evidence of financial fraud. The meeting lasted 22 minutes. At minute 16, Parker stood up, yelled something about betrayal, and stormed out. Dennis followed him, red-faced and shaking. I just sat there and watched. A week later, Thorn Agritech was under federal audit. Marcus was appointed interim CEO. And me? I walked into my father's old office, the one Parker had gutted and replaced with minimalist chrome furniture, and I put Dad's photo back on the desk. "We're not done yet," I whispered. Parker tried to retaliate. He sued me personally, claimed emotional damages, defamation, unlawful seizure of assets. It went nowhere. I had documentation, witnesses, even a signed memo from him back in 2020 admitting he'd altered my signature for expediency. His lawyers dropped him. Dennis retired quietly and moved to Arizona. Parker went bankrupt within the year. Caitlin sold him out during a deposition. The shell companies were dissolved and all funds were clawed back into the estate. I didn't just burn it down. I took back every brick. And then I rebuilt it. Not to get rich, not to gloat, but to honor the man who raised me and to remind the world that legacy isn't something you inherit, it's something you protect. The farm got its name back. The trust now funds agricultural scholarships for kids from rural schools. Dad would have liked that. Sometimes I still walk the fields at dawn, coffee in hand, listening to the wind. It's quiet now, clean, free. And if Parker ever finds the nerve to crawl back from wherever he's hiding, I hope he knows this. I'm still watching. When the smoke cleared and the headlines faded, I was left standing in the ruins of everything Parker tried to steal. But they weren't my ruins. They were his. And in that silence, I found something I hadn't felt since the day Dad died. Peace. I didn't celebrate publicly. There were no champagne bottles, no press conferences. Just me, alone in the old barn we'd restored on the southern plot, reading Dad's handwritten farm logs from the 1980s. His notes were meticulous, hopeful, even funny. I found one entry where he joked about Parker messing up the irrigation schedule and almost flooding the cattle pens. "Boy's got more ambition than sense," he wrote. That line stayed with me, because it was true then and painfully true now. The final nail in Parker's coffin came not from me, but from the people he used. Caitlin turned state's witness and got full immunity in exchange for testifying about Parker's offshore laundering scheme. The FBI found over $3.8 million siphoned from trust-linked accounts into foreign holdings under fake names. That was enough for a lifetime ban from holding corporate positions and full forfeiture of remaining assets. He wasn't just out of the family business. He was legally barred from touching anything related to Thorn Agritech or the Thorn legacy ever again. The house he grew up in, sold at auction. His private condo in Miami, repossessed. His cars, watches, company shares, all gone.
In the end, Parker moved into a one-bedroom rental in Kansas City, living off a modest allowance from a distant cousin who hadn't yet disowned him. Last I heard, he's working at a co-op under a different name, probably pretending to be a consultant or some nonsense. I didn't care. I wasn't doing this for revenge anymore. Not really. What I wanted, what I needed, was to restore what my father built and make sure no one ever did this again. I poured my time into the land. I reconnected with old employees Parker had fired. I hired back loyal people and promoted new ones who understood what the Thorn name used to mean. I created a policy of full transparency in all accounting, made every report public for shareholders, and put safeguards in place that made it impossible for another Parker to rise from the inside. Gloria, who'd voted with me in that fateful meeting, became CFO. Marcus stayed on as CEO. And me? I stayed where I belonged. In the soil. In the fields. In the real heartbeat of the company. A year after reclaiming the estate, I visited Mom and Dad's graves. I stood between the two stones, placed a single sunflower between them, and told them the truth. He tried, but he failed. You trusted the wrong son, but I made it right. And as the wind blew through the grass, and the sky turned gold with evening, I knew something I hadn't dared believe before. I wasn't the black sheep anymore. I was the heir. I was the protector. I was the thorn that endured.